Okay, again, good evening. Welcome to Mass Bay RE's third Thursday program for September 18th. We're pleased to welcome our old friend Carl Fowler to Mass Bay RE this evening with his program, Colorado and the West, Standard Gauge Memories. Carl Fowler's mom was a Pullman reservationist at Penn Station for the Pennsylvania Railroad, so passenger rail was in the family DNA. Carl ran a rail travel and tour company, the Rail Travel Center, Rail Travel Adventures, from 1983 to 2016. He has been a Rail Passenger Association, formerly National Association of Railroad Passengers, member since 1967, and served as an RPA vice chair. In his lifetime, he has ridden passenger trains over 300,000 miles worldwide and led group rail tours for decades. He has served for the past 25 years on the Vermont Rail Advisory Council and made the original proposal for the Daylight Vermonter, which saved passenger service in Vermont when Amtrak killed the overnight Montrealer in 1995. Carl has been a frequent contributor to our Third Thursday programs in the past few years. Most recently, his Transportation in the Catskills program in January of this year, which is available for viewing on Mass Bay RE's YouTube channel. So on to tonight's program. Train buffs often think of Colorado solely in terms of its narrow gauge lines, but the Centennial State and the Western United States are also home to some of the most historic and beautiful standard gauge railways. This program tonight offers snapshots of the standard gauge scene from 1965 when Carl moved to Denver to attend college and forwarded until the 1990s. So Carl, welcome back once again to Mass Bay RE.
Thank you very much. A fun episode, less formal history than I usually do. And there's also a need to explain from the beginning that for some of you who remember old programs of mine, you saw some of these slides in 2022 in a program about the end of the private passenger train era and the dawn of Amtrak. And this is, in one sense, a shortened version of it, but it's been expanded with all kinds of steam material. And so basically, I look at this as a series of train journeys out of Denver back at the end of the last century, having fun and enjoying the experience while I could, because sadly, when I got to Colorado in 1965, turned out to be when the mass unraveling of train services began. When I first was there, for example, there was a combined consolidated special timetable just for Denver Union Station, which on the Rio Grande alone had the Royal Gorge, the California Zephyr, the Yampa Valley Mail, and the Prospector. Within 3 years, everything was gone except the California Zephyr, and that sort of proved to be the case consistently. So this is Last Runs and Survivors, and we'll start with the California Zephyr, the real CZ, the combined Western Pacific Rio Grande Burlington train, which in March of 1970 was discontinued west of Salt Lake City and replaced by a tri-weekly service, which the Burlington prosaically called California Service, just California Service, but the Rio Grande called the Rio Grande Zephyr. And it would prove to be a wonderful train that was long-lasting. Classic Rio Grande picture on the left, and on the right, an Amtrak photo of the Zephyr in Maritimes with the Gross Dam behind it, which impounds water for the Boulder and City and County of Denver water supplies, piped under the Continental Divide through the pioneer bore of the Moffat Tunnel. Rio Grande Zephyr itself would run from 1970 to 1983. Amtrak was sure that Rio Grande was going to join Amtrak in 1971, and so they issued their first national timetable with the California Zephyr being run over their line on the Rio Grande as the operating carrier west of Denver, but it never happened. Gus Adelot, the president of the Rio Grande, supposedly said, "My God, keep that government railroad off my property," and he decided to go on running his own train. But he didn't do it in a crummy manner. He did it in a remarkable manner. It no longer needed sleeping cars, although the sleepers had been provided during the era of that combined California Service and Rio Grande Zephyr. When it became the Rio Grande Zephyr only and ran solely between Winter Park and Salt Lake, it carried dome cars, a full dining car, an observation lounge car, and could expand from a short consist as one combine, one dome coach, the diner and the observation lounge, to a consist with 2 flat top coaches, 4 dome coaches, a dome coffee shop car, a diner, and an observation lounge. And interestingly, as this train ran through the years, its patronage climbed rather than dropping. It's a good view of it each morning. The passenger traffic manager of the Rio Grande Railway was a gentleman named Len Bernstein, and he really was committed to this train. He had been a dining car steward, and standards were never declining on the Rio Grande with respect to food service. And we'll show you an example of that on the Prospector train in a little bit. But Mr. Bernstein would come down to Denver Union Station every morning the train was running to see it off and to make sure that everything was fine before it departed for Grand Junction in Salt Lake City. And he continued doing this even after Amtrak took over the operation in 1983. He lived to be 95, a remarkable gentleman. One of the great stories of my life was that in the late 1970s, the Grand decided to cut back the length of the run of the Rio Grande Zephyr. Instead of going from Denver to Salt Lake with a limousine connection to Ogden so you could continue on to San Francisco, the Rio Grande petitioned the ICC to cut the train west of Grand Junction, Colorado. I was strongly opposed to this and set myself to testify at the hearings that were held by the ICC examiner on what to do with this. Interestingly, about 6 days before the hearings, I got a very quiet phone call in the evening at home from Len Bernstein. The passenger traffic manager said, "Carl, I want you to know this. I hope you're taking a proper day off from work because they put a private detective on you and they're checking you out to see what would happen if you snuck away from work to do the testimony." That was deeply appreciated. I wasn't sneaking away from work. I wasn't that dumb, but I couldn't believe that Mr. Bernstein had taken that kind of risk. And he also slipped me some information that I was authorized to share as long as I didn't attribute it, including the fact that, for example, the Grand was charging the entire expense of the car wash operation in Salt Lake City to the Zephyr, even though it was only washed 3 times a week. Whatever may have been the case, I was able to answer the question, the one trap question that was always a standard at train off hearings, which is you would say you love the train, you wanted to keep running, and the railroad's attorney would turn to you and say, "You know, that's wonderful, sir. And by the way, could I ask when you last rode it?" Well, in my case, I think I made 26 trips on the Rio Grande Zephyr in its history, and I was able to come back with, well, which one would you like, the 2 this spring? I worked for the state of Colorado in that period, and we had offices in Glenwood and Grand Junction, and I became the deputy director of the branch of special programs, which I joked was everything we didn't want to do. But I traveled frequently to the Western Slope in the winter. I used the Zephyr as my primary means of transportation. So I could answer with a pretty straight face that I had ridden it multiple times that very year. This is a classic advertising shot of the real California Zephyr in the Glenwood Canyon. And if you look very carefully on the left, you can see a tiny miniature train car standing on a stone pylon. This was a siding in the canyon where, if on time, the east and westbound Zephyrs met, and that miniature car was, quote, a monument to an idea, close quote, to the invention of the Vista Dome car, which supposedly was conceived by the president of the Burlington Railroad when he was riding as a guest through the Glenwood Canyon up in a locomotive and could see this incredible panorama that you couldn't see back in the coaches, and came up with the idea of a glass top bubble on top of the coaches. So while the Rio Grande didn't run the first dome cars, it inspired their creation. This is a picture I took many years later of the Rio Grande Zephyr opposite that siding. The forest had grown up quite a bit by then, but you can still pick her out pretty well. Coming into Glenwood Springs, Colorado, which was probably accountable for 75% of the traffic on the train west of Denver. The world's largest open air outdoor hot springs pool is purportedly in Glenwood Springs, and if it isn't the largest, it's damn close. It's bigger than a football field. It's right across that bridge on the right-hand side, on the far side of the river. On the left was the one of several grand hotels for the railroad setting. And this remains a very important spot for Amtrak as well, but due to Amtrak's refusal in recent years to run any extra capacity between Denver and Salt Lake City, the ridership on Amtrak here to Glenwood is not what it once was. However, the Rocky Mountaineer Tour train from British Columbia now makes runs from Denver out to Moab, Utah, once a week in the summer, and it overnights in each direction in Glenwood Springs. So the station is certainly as busy as ever. The dining car on the Rio Grande Zephyr. Again, standards were never allowed to drop. Swede Nielsen was the steward this particular day. To the last run of this train in April of 1983, you could get a steak at breakfast. It was very special. This is a picture I took on New Year's Day of 1971, just before the startup of Amtrak later that year in May. And you know it's from near the end because the timetables in the writing shelf are Burlington green timetables after the Burlington Northern merger. So there's really a BN timetable there. View out of the observation car in Grand Junction while they were switching an extra car off. West of Grand Junction, you don't see as many photos as you do from east of there for the obvious reason that it's desolate desert, but it's a spectacular desolate desert as you go through the Book Cliff Basin. And on that trip back in 1970, the Zephyr was leaving Denver as early as 6:30 in the morning, which meant that you got a lot more daylight in the winter than you would have at later years. And I've got a number of pretty good shots out in the Utah section of the line. Now, this is a surprise photo. In April of 1983, I decided to go down to Salt Lake City to go skiing. At that time, I was living up in the Seattle area, and gasp, I flew down on Western Airlines, went up to Park City to ski. Had a great time, but I unbelievably forgot my sunscreen. And the next morning, I had the sunburn from hell. And I decided I'm not going skiing again. I'll go down to the station. Maybe I'll take the Rio Grande Zephyr up to Helper and then come back on Trailways bus, Continental Trailways. So I went down to the station, and this was what I found. She was looking beautiful and shiny as always. In fact, as we went east, the greatest landslip in modern times in the history of the state of Utah was just beginning with the Great Thistle landslide. There was no mass flash flood, but the Thistle slide came down with such force that it dammed up the Spanish Fork River. And the way the Rio Grande was able to resume service months later was to drill a brand new 3,000-foot long tunnel and a realigned main line to get around this remarkable mudslide. The mudslide was eventually removed, but a long branch line that went down to southern Utah never reopened. And the train that I was on that morning turned out to be the last eastbound departure of the RGZ. She got back the next day from Denver, but by then the slide had gotten really more threatening, and the next morning they brought it back to Denver over the Union Pacific with no Rio Grande passengers on board. This is just before Helper. Train board at Helper. If you look at this, there's a little hint of the contraction of the railway over the years. At the very top of this, you can see stations including Thistle and Springville, which was way down again in southern Utah. That had been painted out for many years, but there used to be passenger service down that line. By this point, the train is tri-weekly. It's marked up late in both directions on the day that I took this shot, but only by about 45 minutes to an hour. Amtrak took over again in July of 1983. And to start with, they really decided to advertise the Zephyr. They hired an aircraft. I did not take this picture. This is an Amtrak official public relations shot. It shows it beginning to go around the legendary Big Ten curve and loops just west of Denver. In a couple of moments, the train will be passing what appears to be a coal train on a siding, but is actually a line of hopper cars filled with stone to protect against the incredible Chinook winds that blow down off the front range of the Rockies. And at one point in the 1950s, that actually derailed a freight train there, thus the permanent windbreak. These pictures were taken from a wonderful website called coloradorailfan.com, which I had hoped to give you a lead to today, but is not currently available. I paid the gentleman who's responsible for Colorado Railfan, a gentleman named Kevin Morgan, for the use of these in my tour company. And he took fabulous pictures of the train. And we'll use a Rio Grande dome car shot on what appears to be a not so well washed front end window set to segue onto from the longest and grandest domeliner to the shortest. Here's the train board at Denver before massive train offs had begun. We've lost the Prospector, but we've still got the Yampa Valley Mail here on the right and the California Zephyr. A railfan pointed out to me today that technically the Yampa Valley Mail wasn't the mail after 1983 because the post office had pulled the contract. but Rio Grande people always called her the Yampa Valley Mail. And interestingly enough, even after it lost the mail contract, every morning a bag of some kind of mail was put off well into the late 1960s at Pine Cliff, west of Denver. The Yampa Valley Mail turned into the world's shortest domeliner, although on this photo you wouldn't guess it. This is a picture I took in Craig, Colorado, on the very last run on April 7th, 1968. Normally, this train was typically an Alco locomotive, a baggage car, one coach, dome coach, and that was the train. Occasionally a couple of extra coaches for skiers, but basically it was the world's shortest domeliner, but it was beautifully run, it was kept spotlessly clean, and it was a joy to ride. This is the interior of the Craig station moments before departure. I cut a deal with the conductor and the ticket agent to buy the last ticket ever issued in Craig. I just bought one down the first stop down the line, and that I would be able to get on the train and we would leave immediately. And it worked, although alas, I tried to show you that ticket today and now I can't find it, which breaks my heart. It'll turn up someday, borrowed, but it's disappeared at the moment. But I bought the last ticket ever issued at Craig on the Moffat Railway, the Denver and Salt Lake, which was supposed to have gone all the way to Salt Lake City, but never got west of Craig, which it reached in 1913 when Mr. Moffat ran out of money. This last run was a remarkable train because the National Railway Historical Society had a very large group on it. Multiple dome cars, multiple first-class lounge cars, coaches borrowed from the Union Pacific, many of the Rio Grande spare coaches. And west end of the branch line to Craig is truly magnificent scenery. It makes a crossing of the Rockies over to Ponus Summit. No passenger train has gone this way since this date back in April of '68. But interestingly enough, that may not be the case much longer. We'll show you that in just a moment. The Rio Grande was very good about doing charters. The last time I showed this slide, I thought this was a picture from a charter that I had with them for a University of Denver group. But in looking at it again now, I think it was simply a stop we had to make while they cleared a minor slide because there's not enough coach capacity. We chartered the second coach car on this train, which is actually a coffee shop lounge car that had been used on the Royal Gorge. And we had that on our dormitory trip for the day up to Winter Park. But we also had a couple of the heavyweight coaches from the Prospector, and they're not here. The car on the rear end is actually the Wilson McCarthy, which was the private car of the president of the Rio Grande Railroad. There's a more normal day at Bond, where it left the main line to diverge up over to Ponus Summit to get up into the northwest corner of the state. This dome observation car had actually been built originally for the Chesapeake and Ohio for use on its never operated chassis streamliner. Now, that's a pretty weird statement, for use on a train that never operated. But the chassis decided after World War II to run this fantastic domeliner from Washington, D.C. and Newport News each day, combining at Charlottesville to Cincinnati, dawn to dusk. And if it had ever operated, it would have been the most amazing daylight train ever operated in North America. But there was a general coal strike before the C&O could get the equipment. And when the strike ended, management opinions had changed. And while all of the cars were delivered, they were never run for their intended purpose. And the Rio Grande bought 3 coach observation lounge dome cars from the C&O, and this was one of them. For many years, they used them on the overnight service from Denver to Salt Lake down through the Royal Gorge. In later years, after that train had been discontinued, they used them on the Yampa Valley Mail. And you can see they were adapted to be cut in the middle of a train as well. Now, this is why I said that may not have actually been the last passenger train up to Craig. The state of Colorado, amazingly enough, using mostly revenues from special taxes on rental cars, is actively planning a number of new Amtrak services, one of which is Mountain Rail, which would run initially an extension of the Winter Park ski train out to Kremling, but eventually would run all the way through to Craig. And this is a very serious plan. They believe, in fact, that they can fund this. When the Rio Grande was in business, it was a lessee of the Moffat Tunnel, which belonged to a taxing district. Most recently, the state of Colorado has allowed the UP to acquire the tunnel, but as a condition of that acquisition, the UP has granted the state the right to run daily at least 5 passenger trains a day in each direction through the Moffat Tunnel, not counting the Rocky Mountaineer, which is considered a completely separate operation. And ultimately, 2 of those would go theoretically to Craig, one coming down in the morning to Denver and one going up from Denver in the morning. In the shorter term, again, it'll be an extension of the ski train. Got to ride that a number of times, perhaps most interestingly on February 26, 1978, when I didn't ride the train, but drove up to East Portal. I was pretty lucky because it was snowing and the road up to East Portal was sometimes pretty hard to negotiate in the winter, but it was the 50th birthday of the opening of the 6.2 mile long Moffat Tunnel. And these are pictures from that opening. These two gentlemen had been there at the original opening and had saved not only the picture, but the front page of the Denver Post that day. February 26, 1978. We had two passenger trains running on each other's markers virtually through the tunnel that day. First was the Rio Grande ski train, which that day had the F units that normally were used on the Rio Grande Zephyr. These legendary old coaches that were on the ski train, 1917 Northern Pacific day coaches, which the Rio Grande bought and maintained beautifully. Then about 10 minutes behind the ski train, the Rio Grande Zephyr, using Jeeps that day. 50 years, the Moffat Tunnel. And that was 78. She's moving on now. The ski train had been started before World War II by the Rio Grande Railroad to serve the Winter Park Ski Resort, which interestingly enough, although 60 miles to the west of Denver, is a city and county of Denver Park. And the ski train was a tremendous success. I grant it, it taught me how to ski. I rode it in college almost every weekend up to the mountains to ski on. They would actually sell the lift tickets on board. When the Rio Grande was running it was a pretty Spartan operation. There was no food service of any kind, but the cars were exquisitely maintained and the train was very popular. In later years, the Rio Grande gradually lost some of the business from the Eskimo Ski Club, which for decades had produced multiple coaches full of kids at each run. And ultimately, when the Rio Grande was merged into the Southern Pacific by the Anschutz Corporation, this train set was replaced by cars that had been seconded from Via Rail Canada. And ultimately, when liability insurance rates climbed, the ski train was discontinued completely, although it did not stay discontinued for very long. It's back now as the Winter Park Express on Amtrak, and it was the incredible success of the revived ski train that has led to this remarkable idea to actually reopen passenger service to Craig. The Craig branch was primarily in recent years a coal hauling line. And like many coal hauling railroads, much of that traffic has now disappeared. Multiple additional branch lines have been built at the west end up into the mountains to coal mines, which not many of which are still being used. But the Mountain Rails passenger scheme also includes additional trains at the west end to serve the Steamboat Springs Ski Resort and to serve ski area developments nearby, condos, houses, hotels, etc. This is perhaps the least known of all of the pre-World War II streamliners. This was the Rio Grande's attempt to upgrade its overnight Denver Salt Lake service with a Bud-built streamliner, not called the Zephyr in this case, called the Prospector. This train started running in 1941 and it only operated for 9 months. The equipment simply couldn't handle the mountain grades on the Rio Grande, and it didn't last long. The first car had a sort of day coach mail baggage facility in it. The second car had a small cafe buffet and a small sleeping car with sections and a couple of rooms. A nice train, but because of the war, when the Rio Grande returned it to the Bud Company, it was scrapped. Had the war not come on, perhaps it might have been expanded and remotored, but this ran only very briefly. And then the name the Prospector was revived after the war and marketed from at least 1947 to 1967 aggressively as overnight, every night, Denver to Salt Lake. This was the evening of the last overnight in Denver. I'm on behind the coach seat. My friend Chris Carriere is in the there. We decided to ride it up to Winter Park, spend the night in the ski lodge in Winter Park, and come back in the morning. This was the last run. And we are probably a quarter of the passengers on board, which is a pretty sad comment. The eastbound coming back had 35 in coach and 13 in sleeper. This was another of the cars that the Rio Grande had acquired, in this case, indirectly from the C&O. The C&O placed one of the largest car orders in the US after World War II, but by the time it was time to get delivery, they realized they had gone way over the top on car ordering. And the Rio Grande was able to buy from the Pullman Company 25 cars that had been intended for the C&O, including 2 remarkable diners in which the kitchen was in the middle of the car. And this allowed them to use one end as a lounge and the other as a diner, but on busy days to make it all a diner. And these cars were assigned for their entire career on the Rio Grande to the Prospector train. Very briefly, from 1963 to 66, these had had only a very minimum, almost like an Am dinette service on them, but for 90% of their history, including again at the very end when the Rio Grande made a last attempt to really make this train work, they had a remarkable menu. This is the final menu from literally the final day. I asked the steward if I could have a collectible copy, and he gave me all of the copies on board after dinner. And coming down into Denver, the steward on that section of the train gave me all the breakfast menus. So here's the last dinner menu ever used on the Prospector. Note the first item on the dinner side on the left in the main entrees, native mountain trout. That was the Rio Grande's legendary dining car special. You can go back to timetables from the 19th century on the Rio Grande Railroad, and somewhere in the timetable there'll be a little box with a drawing of a trout on it, and the caption will read, "Mountain trout in the diner every evening." And again, no dining car ever operated as a full diner on the Rio Grande without offering trout. But this car also could give you a very nice light menu. If you look over on the right-hand side, an extensive sandwich and entree menu selection, really quite extraordinary. And in addition, there was that extra menu I showed for a moment ago on the right, the Prospector steak dinner, which I detached from the menu so you could read it better. But full steak dinner was $3.75 in 1967 on the last run of the Prospector. This was the breakfast menu. This did not include a steak. In that respect, it was one notch down from the Rio Grande Zephyr or the California Zephyr, which actually also offered lamb chops at breakfast, but still a very nice menu. This is the lounge end. And again, these tables could easily be set up as additional dining if you had a really busy day and capacity required. So this is the final eastbound, number 8, arriving at the Winter Park Ski Resort station just about 5:55 in the morning. A little bit better ridership again in the eastbound direction. They had almost 50 riders on board, but not enough. The Prospector had never been a heavy mail train, but the mail had been incredibly important to it. Before the first mail contract west of Grand Junction was lost in '66, this train garnered $500,000 a year just from the Grand Junction to Salt Lake mail car. When the post office announced that it was going to take the final mail car off from Grand Junction to Denver, the Rio Grande threw in the towel and filed a train-off petition. We were told that this was universal zip code and universal air mail, and the mail would be so much better. So much better that, for example, if after the demise of the Prospector, you mailed a letter in Denver in the evening, they flew it to Salt Lake City and then trucked it over 200 miles back to Grand Junction if that was your destination. And what had infallibly been delivered the next morning when the train was running would typically arrive 2 to 3 days later. But that was improved all universal air service circa 1967. Steam, of course, had for decades gone through the Moffat Tunnel, but the last attempt to run a steam train through occurred on a Rocky Mountain Railroad Club trip on May 5th, 1966, using a little steam engine that had been built for the Great Western Railway, a sugar carrier north of Denver, which did offer a limited passenger service. She used some of the ski train cars, and we got away in the morning out of Denver. It was a foggy morning, and pretty quickly the engine began to steam badly. And it turned out they had gotten bad clinker coal. This is the beginning of the Big Ten curve. This is what we ran into a few minutes later. And we didn't leave this passing track for many hours because they couldn't get enough fire up in the boiler to feel safe about it. Ultimately, a diesel got us up to the Moffat Tunnel, where the diesel was turned on the stub of the line over the top of the world over Rollins Pass. But this was the last steam excursion standard gauge ever on the Rio Grande Railroad. And Mr. Adelot and his general managers were furious. I could hear the conductor talking to dispatch, and this was not what was going to happen. By this time, the Rio Grande was into frequent, short, fast freights running to passenger train schedules and with passenger train punctuality. And this little steam excursion tied up the main line for a whole day. And there was never another one like it. Indeed, there was never even another diesel excursion in the Rio Grande pre-Amtrak era after this disastrous trip in '66. But there were ghosts around. This was the interior of the Union Pacific Roundhouse in Cheyenne, about 1968. The big boy, one which has gone to Omaha now. Turbine in the background. Not visible here is the big 212, the big 210-2 that went to what used to be the Rock Island Shops at Silvis, Illinois recently, along with the 3985 Challenger. But in this period, in the 60s and 70s, the name of the game was the 844. To keep the 844 running, the only standard gauge steam engine never taken off the active roster of a Class 1 railroad. To keep her going, the UP stripped a variety of her sisters. This was the 838 in the Cheyenne yards, again, probably about 1967. She's missing her headlight and lots of other parts, but she still exists. 844 was, in the time I rode behind her for years, the 8444, because a new diesel engine had taken her number. Interesting enough, she outlived the diesel engine that replaced her, and now she's back to being 844. This was not only the only steam engine never off the roster of an active Class 1 railroad, but the last mainline passenger high-speed steam engine ever delivered in the United States. And the 800 class Northerns could make 100 miles an hour with no problem, and I clocked them more than once, even on excursions, doing that. The classic Union Pacific excursion in this era, and these trips were sponsored out of Denver by both the Rocky Mountain Railroad Club and by the Intermountain chapter of the NRHS. The classic excursion was Denver to Cheyenne to Laramie and back in the day. Although in 1966, they actually tried to get all the way to Rawlins and back in a day. Made it, but in a day meant we got home at like 11 o'clock at night. After that, they never tried to go quite that far again. This is one of the excursions just leaving Cheyenne. Almost immediately leaving Cheyenne, you begin the climb over Sherman Hill, which is not only the highest point on the Union Pacific, but was until the Rio Grande joined Amtrak, the highest point in the Amtrak system as well. The UP actually has two completely different routes over Sherman Hill, and these photos are a bit of a combination of the two, but the grades are serious. This is on the new, supposedly lower grade Sherman Hill South line. As you can see, that being on the train at least, the uphill is very obvious. Incredible cuts were dug for the new Sherman Hill South line. This is one of them. This is a classic UP run-by site. Further west, the wild, mysterious, strange, stony landscape of Sherman Hill. Big mountainous piles of rock like giants had stacked them, and what they called the Red Buttes. Descending down into Laramie, which is the home, among other things, of the University of Wyoming. We're in the Laramie station here. Now, these excursions continued into the Amtrak era, and in fact, in the earliest years of Amtrak, if there was going to be a UP excursion, frequently the Union Pacific sent the coaches down one day, and the next day they sent the 844 down, not infrequently actually on the front of the Amtrak train, which after the Rio Grande refused to join Amtrak was running over the Union Pacific's traditional route until 1983 at least. So here we have one of the excursion trains at Laramie with the earliest version of the Amtrak San Francisco Zephyr, first actually known as the city of San Francisco, passing through. Note there's no dome car on her. Amtrak could not get an agreement out of the Southern Pacific to use anything except the SP's homemade three-quarter domes. And if one of those had a problem one day, it couldn't make it, and there was no dome car on the train at all. Ultimately, Amtrak managed to negotiate with the SP to send traditional domes and superliners through the snow sheds on Donner Pass. But at this time, if the SP's own homemade dome cars were not available, you didn't have a dome. This shot at St. Vrain is on a branch line called the Dent Branch, which is now hosting Denver electric commuter rail trains, at least near Denver, up to 126th Street, I believe. On December 16, 1966, on impulse, I decided to go down to Denver to see the departure at midday of the Texas Zephyr. What I didn't know was that the Colorado Southern Burlington Line subsidiary had just gotten permission from the Interstate Commerce Commission to drop the midday departure of the Texas Zephyr, and instead to have it assume the schedule of its slower running mate that left Denver in the evening. So when I got down to the station, I was advised this was actually the final run. And I ran back into the station and bought a round trip ticket to Pueblo, intending to come back on number 8, the mail train, which was also making its last run. It was theoretically an impossible connection. The two trains both arrived and departed Pueblo at the same time, but I'd spoken to the conductor on the southbound, and he promised to call his companion on the northbound train, and unless they were really late and trying to make up time, they would hold the northbound for me. If they didn't have the opportunity to do it, I'd get off in Colorado Springs. On that too good a deal to pass up, I took the ride. And here's the northbound number 8, which says it's the Texas Zephyr if you look on the engine. And the next day it would be, but this schedule was actually a combination at this time of Santa Fe from La Junta, connecting off the Chief, and a mail train from Dallas-Fort Worth on the Fort Worth and Denver and Colorado and Southern. You can tell this is in Pueblo, not in Denver, with a curved platform. Pueblo Union Station almost formed a circle like on a model railroad going in and out. Silver Racer, E5, Texas Zephyr. One of these engines is now part of the Illinois Railroad Museum's collection and occasionally powers the Nebraska Zephyr set. Here's the boarding call back at Denver. That observation car was a rather interesting car. It was a diner lounge observation, and it had been built for the earliest pre-World War II edition of this train, kicked down into secondary standby status when the Burlington assigned the 1937 Denver Zephyr train sets to the Texas Zephyr when the new domeliner DZ was delivered in 1956. And then when those articulated sets became too expensive to maintain, it got its original assignment back on the rear end of the Texas Zephyr, at least until this day. Thereafter, the dining car was added at Amarillo and did not come through to Denver. So this car dates back to about 1937, but it looks like it was made yesterday. It's actually a 30-year-old car. An old friend reappears again. This is the Great Western Sugar Engine 51 again that we had such a disastrous experience with on the Rio Grande. This turned out to be the last Colorado and Southern steam trip, but nothing went wrong on this one. She ran like a dream. She had been used recently in a movie about the Manassas Mauler, and so Manassas Mauler is still on the tender, alas, but she ran like a dream. Went from Denver up to Boulder and Longmont and back. Not a very long trip, but again, the last time that a steam engine ran on the Colorado and Southern, at least with passengers behind it. This engine is still up in that area of northern Colorado to this day. It's stored in a warehouse in Meade, Colorado. It's about half a mile from where my daughter and her husband had a house for quite a few years, although they now live in Texas. And I got to see this engine. It belonged to a doctor named John Birmingham, and he rented it out as a movie train, and it still does that. From time to time, this engine shows up in Hollywood movies shot out in the West. Jack Dempsey wasn't there, obviously, but the Manassas Mauler documentary had a train with his name on it. Now, this is the last dedicated streamliner delivered to any American railroad after World War II, the 1956 edition of the Denver Zephyr. And this is its last run on its classic Burlington route schedule. This is the day before Amtrak. Went down to Denver Union Station, bought a round trip ticket to Chicago. One of the ways you know this is a last run is that they've already cut a Union Pacific dormitory car into the consist back behind that Burlington Northern engine. And of course, the engine painted up for the BN is another tip. But the Denver Zephyr never lost money to the day it went into Amtrak. Burlington never attempted to discontinue it. They did make some minor downgrades that took away the chuck wagon car, except in peak seasons after 1967. And they ran the observation lounge car as a mid-train lounge instead of an observation lounge, but very minor changes. And on this last run, she was a big train again. See, there were 2 slumber coaches that day. And the car behind it is the observation car again. This is the interior of that observation car. It's called the Colorado Room. And these are leather portraits, leather paintings that were done uniquely for each car. In a general comment, the seats look like power car chairs, and depending upon the era, the Burlington would sell you one of these as a power car seat, but not for the overnight ride. So you could book it stations between Chicago and Omaha, or Omaha and Denver, but not all the way through. Again, you can tell this is fairly late in time because the timetable is in the format used only for a couple of years before the Burlington Northern merger. But the Denver Zephyr was always exquisitely kept up. Until 1967, when Louis Menck became president and didn't really like passenger trains very much, this train routinely ran in 2 sections every weekend throughout the year. And the Pullman section would have as many as 14 or 15 cars on it. Coach section, the Pullman section, chasing each other by 5 to 10 minutes across the Intermountain country to Chicago. This is what connected to train 8 at Pueblo when that last picture was taken of the CNS train, but thereafter ran all the way through to Denver. The Santa Fe was trying to get rid of its legendary chief by 1967. And to do so, they paid a price, which is that when the Interstate Commerce Commission allowed them to discontinue the chief, they were ordered to maintain its connecting service between La Junta and Denver. The Santa Fe, normally the most pro-passenger of railroads, did this in a very grudging way. This train would leave Denver about 4 in the afternoon and get down to La Junta around 8 in the evening and connect to the eastbound Super Chief El Capitan. In the other direction, you could get off the Super Chief El Capitan from Los Angeles and connect to a stub that got you up to Denver a little bit after midnight. But you couldn't get from Chicago to Denver without a 12-hour layover in La Junta, and in the opposite direction, an overnight layover. This train did any business at all was a near miracle, but it ended up being the only passenger train still running between Denver, Colorado Springs, and Pueblo. And so up to Amtrak Day, it would have typically 10 or 15 riders on a given day. I decided on Thanksgiving Eve of 1970 to take a ride on it and photograph the Super Chief El Cap. When I got to La Junta, I realized I had never ridden the Super Chief, and I went into the station and on impulse bought a ticket to Chicago and rode it to Chicago. Here it is in 1966, when in the summer it still ran separately from the El Cap, about 5 minutes in front of it. Took 5 diesel engines, and there were 15 cars on this train, and in back of it, the all-coach Super El Capitan. But these are pictures I took on that Thanksgiving trip. And it has to be said, the Santa Fe never gave up on online passenger service on the Super Chief El Cap. But on this trip, we had, if the conductor told me correctly, after Kansas City, 7 passengers on the Super Chief. This is the main dining room. And here is the legendary turquoise room, which adjoined it underneath the dome lounge car. It's just set up as lounge here, but you could have a meal here, either as a private party, or if there was no one booking it for private party meals, just as a particularly elegant dining room. There's a giant piece of beautiful jade there. I always loved the decor in this car. It was a very unique set of lounge cars. There were 6 of these. They called them the Pleasure Dome lounge cars, but they were basically super elegant private club in their atmosphere. Modern furnishings, but elegantly done. Under the dome, this bar with original sand paintings, Navajo sand paintings, and there were 6 of these cars and 6 completely different sand paintings stretched between them. And up in the dome, the only dome car I know of that ever had polar car seating in it, revolving, rotating polar car seats. There were only, I think, 8 on each side. Most dome cars sat 24 people. This would have sat 16. And I could be wrong on that because I don't have a picture of the other end of it. But this was a very unique car. Most of these still exist and are on private hands on various tourist railroads or in private car service. 5 minutes again behind the Super Chief came the El Cap in the summers. The Amtrak Southwest Chief is the direct descendant of these trains. This was just before the departure that Thanksgiving night. I had, again, not ridden the El Cap at that point and didn't until later, but did get my one ride in on the Super Chief from La Junta all the way to Chicago. And of course, all of this had been caused again by the discontinuance in 1968 of the Chief. This was its last run. Off on the right, you can see the Denver stub behind the baggage carts. This is at La Junta. Just still a pretty big train, but the mail contracts were going, and even a train this important to the Santa Fe was not viable without its mail. These full-length dome lounge cars all still exist on a variety of tourist railroads around the country. Santa Fe, to its surprise, was not able at the time it dropped the Chief to drop the Grand Canyon, which by then had become an all stops local from Chicago to California. There were 80 possible stops, counting flag stops. And the Santa Fe had to run that right up to Amtrak Day because they couldn't actually establish it was losing money, at least not initially. They also had to go on running the San Francisco Chief and the Texas Chief and the San Diegans. But the Santa Fe got rid of the secondary Chief, which was still a very great train, and most of its other secondary trains in a major cutback in 1968. Now, this is just a little Langley app at the end of this show, but the World's Fair in Vancouver, British Columbia in 1986, railroads were a theme. They actually had a short maglev there, but they also wanted to show off the March of Progress, and they held a parade of steam. So this is a series of shots I took of that steam parade. Best Friend of Charleston, brought up by your friends at the Southern Railway, including W. Graham Claytor, who by then was gone as its president. It's a copy of the Rocket, the first successful steam engine in Great Britain. The Tom Thumb from the Baltimore and Ohio. This is the actual copy in the Baltimore, Ohio Museum in Baltimore. This is the John Bull. Pardon me, no, this is the Molson, which is the first steam engine in Atlantic Canada. Here's the John Bull. Virginian Truckee, number 22. Hollywood engine for decades. Heisler, number 91, from the Mount Rainier Scenic in Washington State. UP Yard Switcher 4466 was at Dallas Union Station into the early 1960s. City of Winnipeg hydro engine, which took, as you might imagine from the title, people over to a hydroelectric plant, was used for many years the Prairie Dog Scenic Railway out of Winnipeg. CN 1392, a 460, which is still in occasional service near Edmonton, Alberta, to this day. And Great Western 51, finally back in real Great Western colors, not trying to pretend to be a Rio Grande engine or a CNS engine or a Jack Dempsey engine, number 51. Great Western had 3 steam engines at the end, and all 3 still exist. The biggie is on the Strasburg Road in Pennsylvania. This is a CP Fast Passenger Pacific that belongs to the Museum of Science in Ottawa. It was run for many, many years, but is not operated now for probably at least a decade. The Royal Hudson, that survives as a Royal Hudson, ran for decades in excursion service out of Vancouver, but sadly, with the change of government about the year 2000, ceased to run. It is, however, carefully preserved and displayed on the British Columbia Railway Museum up in Squamish, BC. And the engine that didn't get there. The Burlington Northern would not allow the 844 to run even light up to Vancouver, but this is the UP classic passenger engine until this. This is from an excursion about 1998 that went from Denver all the way to Portland, Oregon, using the Challenger to 3985 and a complete set of UPE units. You can see back behind the extra tenders. This is a run-by approaching Boise, and this is a preview of coming attractions. I'd love to do another program on the 2 UP articulateds. And this is, of course, the big boy on its first inaugural run all the way out to do the second celebration of the Golden Spike in 2019. This is the morning she came into Ogden, running jointly with the 844. It was 80 degrees down in Ogden by the time we got down to Ogden, but 40 miles east of there in Evanston, Wyoming, we were in a sleet and ice storm. And I got this remarkably atmospheric run by in that sleet and ice storm. Strange day. So,
okay, so there's a one question up here in the chat. The question is, why did the YVM always seem to have an Alco PA as the lead locomotive? Was this related to the grades on the route or simply the way DNRGW chose to assign power?
I've never heard a philosophical explanation for it, but it is absolutely true that the Rio Grande's preferred use of the PAs after they were bumped off the California Zephyr, pretty shortly after being assigned to it. First, they went to the Royal Gorge train, which had very steep grades on it, going over Tennessee Pass. And when that was discontinued, they went to the Yampa Valley Mail. They were, at least from my experience, never on a ski train that I rode. If the ski train needed odd power, it would get Jeeps. But I don't know if it was grades. I suspect it may have been because the grade from Bond up over Topona's Summit up to Craig met and equaled 3% for some distance. And the Tennessee Pass grade was 3% at points. But I don't know for sure. I know the Rio Grande gradually disposed of its F units, and that caused more frequent appearances, as you saw in this program, of Jeeps on the Rio Grande Zephyr. But the Yampa Valley Mail, I went to Colorado in 1965. And I don't remember ever being on the Yampa Valley Mail when it didn't have Alco PA power. Their B unit stayed to the very end. The B unit was converted to a steam generator car. And because the Rio Grande never paid to have its coaches equipped with HEP, the B unit was used continuously as the HEP car on, it's a steam generating car on the Rio Grande Zephyr.
Okay. Anyway, thank you very much, Carl, for a fascinating program. A look back at some fascinating equipment and trains that sadly we will unlikely see again in just the variety of the equipment that was out there. Anyway, this will conclude tonight's program.
Thank you.